The most powerful man in Egypt was Pharaoh. But the man who saved Egypt was someone else. At first glance, that statement sounds impossible. How could a foreigner, someone with no royal blood, no army, and no claim to the throne, rise to become the second most powerful man in the greatest kingdom of his age? Yet that is exactly what happened. Nearly 4,000 years ago, in the land of Egypt, a man stood beside Pharaoh as an advisor, administrator, and trusted leader. His decisions would influence millions of lives. His plans would protect entire nations from disaster. Kings listened to him. Officials obeyed him. People traveled from distant lands seeking his help. But Joseph did not begin his life in a palace. He was not born into wealth or political power. He was not raised among Egypt's elite. In fact, there was a time when nobody in Egypt knew his name at all. He arrived as an outsider. A stranger. A young Hebrew far from home. And if you had seen him during the darkest chapter of his life, you would never have guessed what his future held. That is what makes Joseph's story one of the most remarkable journeys in all of history. Because this is not simply the story of success. It is the story of purpose. The story of how setbacks became stepping stones. How closed doors led to greater opportunities. And how events that appeared meaningless eventually revealed a much larger plan. But before we look at the struggles, before we examine the setbacks, and before we follow Joseph through the unexpected turns of his life, we need to understand where his journey ultimately led. Imagine standing in ancient Egypt during the height of its power. Massive monuments rose above the landscape. Trade routes stretched across continents. The Nile River brought life to one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. Pharaoh ruled with unmatched authority. Yet on this particular day, another man stood at the center of attention. Joseph. A Hebrew who had once been unknown now carried responsibilities that affected an entire kingdom. He oversaw resources, advised leaders, and managed preparations that would determine whether millions would survive a coming crisis. His rise was so extraordinary that even today historians, scholars, and Bible readers continue to ask the same question. How did this happen? How did a young dreamer become a national leader? How did someone who once seemed forgotten become essential to the future of nations? The answer is not found in a single decision or a lucky break. It is hidden within a series of events that unfolded over many years. Events filled with unexpected twists, difficult seasons, and moments that made no sense at the time. Looking back, the path seems clear. But for Joseph, each step forward often felt uncertain. And perhaps that is why his story continues to resonate with people today. Because many of us know what it feels like to wait, to wonder, and to question where our lives are heading. Yet Joseph's journey reminds us that the beginning of a story rarely reveals its ending. And long before he stood beside Pharaoh, long before nations depended on him, everything began with a young man and a set of dreams that would change his life forever. Long before he advised kings or managed the resources of an empire, he was simply a boy growing up among a large family in the land of Canaan. His world was far removed from the palaces and monuments of Egypt. Rolling hills, grazing flocks, and family tents shaped his daily life. Yet even as a young man, there was something unusual about him. Joseph was the son of Jacob, a patriarch whose family would one day become the nation of Israel. Among Jacob's many sons, Joseph occupied a special place in his father's heart. The reasons were personal and deeply rooted in family history, but the result was impossible to hide. Joseph received attention that his brothers noticed immediately. What might have remained a private family matter gradually became a source of tension. Every gesture seemed to widen the distance between Joseph and his brothers. Every sign of favor made old frustrations grow stronger. But family dynamics alone do not explain why Joseph's story took such a dramatic turn. The real catalyst came through a series of dreams. In the ancient world, dreams were often viewed as more than random thoughts during sleep. Many believed they could carry meaning, messages, or glimpses of future events. Joseph experienced dreams so vivid and so memorable that he felt compelled to share them. In one dream, bundles of grain gathered in a field appeared to bow before his own bundle. In another, celestial bodies seemed to acknowledge him in a position of prominence. To Joseph, these dreams felt important. To those around him, they sounded provocative. Whether he fully understood their meaning or not, his willingness to describe them openly changed everything. His brothers did not hear possibility. They heard prediction. They did not hear mystery. They heard a challenge to the existing order of the family. As resentment quietly deepened, Joseph remained unaware of how much these moments were shaping his future. Like many young people with big dreams, he saw the destination but not the road that led there. He imagined significance without understanding the process required to reach it. He saw promise without seeing the obstacles hidden between the present and the future. Yet that is often how transformative journeys begin. Few people are shown the entire path in advance. Most are given only enough vision to take the first step. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the dreams themselves. But perhaps the most remarkable detail is that Joseph continued to believe there was purpose behind them even when circumstances would later seem to contradict everything they promised. At this stage, however, none of that had happened yet. He was still a young man living under his father's care. The future appeared open and full of possibility. The dreams lingered in everyone's minds. Some remembered them with curiosity. Others remembered them with frustration. Joseph could not see the consequences forming around him. He could not know that the very dreams that seemed to point toward greatness would soon place him on a path he never would have chosen for himself. And as tension within the family continued to grow, a moment was approaching that would change the course of his life forever. The growing tension within the family did not appear overnight. It developed slowly, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. From Joseph's perspective, life continued much as it always had. He worked, traveled, and carried out responsibilities assigned by his father. But beneath the surface, emotions were changing. The dreams that had once seemed like simple stories shared among family members had become symbols of something much larger. Resentment had taken root, and Joseph did not fully grasp how deep it had grown. One day, Jacob asked Joseph to travel and check on his brothers, who were tending flocks far from home. It seemed like an ordinary assignment. The distance was significant, requiring a journey across rough terrain under the hot sun, but there was nothing unusual about the request itself. Joseph set out alone, expecting to find his brothers and return with news for his father. What he could not see was that this journey would become the dividing line between his old life and everything that followed. When he finally located his brothers, the reunion was anything but warm. Years of frustration, jealousy, and unresolved conflict had reached a breaking point. In a single day, Joseph's world changed completely. The young man who had grown up under his father's protection suddenly found himself separated from everything familiar. His home was gone. His family was gone. The future he imagined for himself disappeared almost instantly. Instead of returning home, Joseph was carried away by traders traveling toward Egypt. For the first time in his life, he entered a world he did not know. The language sounded different. The customs were unfamiliar. The landscape itself seemed foreign. Every mile carried him farther from the people and places that had defined his identity. Imagine what that must have felt like. 1 week, you are surrounded by everything familiar. The next, you are moving toward an uncertain future with no clear understanding of what lies ahead. The dreams that once seemed full of promise now appeared distant and impossible. Nothing about his circumstances suggested leadership, influence, or success. If anything, the opposite seemed true. Yet one of the most remarkable aspects of Joseph's story is that the collapse of his plans did not mean the collapse of his purpose. From a human perspective, everything looked lost. The favored son had become an outsider. The dreamer had become a servant. The future leader had become someone with no control over his own path. But history often turns at moments that feel like endings. Many of the greatest transformations begin when people are forced to leave behind the life they expected. Joseph was entering a season that would test his character, challenge his faith, and reshape his understanding of success. Egypt was not simply another destination. It was the center of one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. Vast cities, sophisticated government systems, and enormous economic networks made it unlike anything Joseph had ever known. Somewhere within that immense kingdom, a place was waiting for him. But it was not the place he would have chosen. And before he could discover why he had been brought there, he would first have to learn how to remain faithful when every visible sign of hope seemed to disappear. Arriving in Egypt did not immediately change Joseph's circumstances. If anything, life became more uncertain. He was far from home, surrounded by unfamiliar customs, unfamiliar language, and people who knew nothing about his past. The dreams of his youth must have seemed incredibly distant. Yet this chapter of his life reveals something extraordinary. While Joseph could not control where he was, he could control how he responded. Rather than allowing disappointment to define him, he committed himself to the responsibilities placed before him. Over time, that attitude began to attract attention. Joseph eventually entered the household of Potiphar, an influential Egyptian official who served Pharaoh. It was a position that carried significant authority, and managing such an estate required trust, discipline, and skill. Joseph began with ordinary responsibilities, but his diligence quickly became noticeable. Tasks were completed well. Resources were handled wisely. Problems were solved efficiently. The same young man who had once overseen activities within his father's household now found himself applying those abilities in a completely different environment. Little by little, confidence in him grew. Potiphar recognized something unusual about Joseph. He was dependable. He was organized. He approached his work with integrity. As a result, greater responsibilities followed. One assignment led to another. One opportunity created the next. Eventually, Joseph was entrusted with overseeing much of the household's daily operations. From the outside, it may have appeared that his life was finally moving in the right direction again. After all, he had survived the shock of losing everything familiar. He had adapted to a foreign culture. He had earned the respect of powerful people. Most importantly, he had discovered that difficult circumstances did not have to determine the quality of his character. This is one of the most important lessons in Joseph's journey. Many people wait for ideal conditions before giving their best effort. Joseph did the opposite. He gave his best effort before conditions improved. Long before authority was placed in his hands, he demonstrated responsibility. Long before recognition arrived, he practiced excellence. Long before anyone rewarded his faithfulness, he chose to remain faithful. Yet the story was not moving toward an easy conclusion. In fact, the very success Joseph was beginning to experience would soon place him in an even more difficult situation. That is often how life unfolds. Just when stability seems within reach, unexpected challenges emerge. Just when a person begins to feel secure, circumstances change again. Joseph could not see what was ahead. He likely believed he had finally found solid ground after years of uncertainty. The household was thriving. His reputation was growing. His future appeared brighter than it had in a long time. But beneath the surface, events were already developing that would test him in ways he had never imagined. Once again, the path toward his ultimate purpose was about to take a turn that made no sense at the time. And the progress he had worked so hard to build was about to face its greatest challenge yet. The progress Joseph had achieved inside Potiphar's household seemed to confirm that his life was finally stabilizing. Years earlier, he had lost his home, his family, and the future he once imagined. Yet through diligence and integrity, he had earned trust in one of the most influential households in Egypt. Responsibilities increased. Confidence in his leadership grew. For the first time in a long while, it appeared that the difficult chapter behind him was finally coming to an end. But some of life's greatest tests arrive when success begins to feel secure. Joseph soon found himself facing a situation that no amount of planning could have prevented. An accusation emerged against him, one that was both serious and deeply unfair. The details unfolded rapidly, and before Joseph had any opportunity to defend the reputation he had spent years building, everything changed. Trust disappeared. Position vanished. Opportunities closed. The future he had carefully rebuilt seemed to collapse almost overnight. Imagine the weight of that moment. Joseph had already endured separation from his family. He had already adapted to life in a foreign nation. He had already proven his value through years of faithful service. Yet despite doing the right things, he now faced consequences he did not deserve. This is one of the most challenging realities people encounter in life. We often expect integrity to produce immediate rewards and good decisions to guarantee positive outcomes. But Joseph's experience reminds us that character is not proven when circumstances are easy. Character is revealed when circumstances become difficult. Faced with misunderstanding and loss, Joseph could have surrendered to bitterness. He could have concluded that integrity was pointless. He could have allowed disappointment to define the rest of his story. Instead, he continued moving forward even when the path ahead made no sense. As a result of the accusation, Joseph was sent to prison. The contrast was staggering. Not long before, he had overseen a powerful household. Now he found himself confined within walls that represented limitation rather than opportunity. Once again, the trajectory of his life appeared to be moving downward. If an outside observer had evaluated his situation at that moment, the conclusion would have been obvious. The dreams of his youth had failed. The possibilities that once seemed so promising had vanished. Every step toward progress had been erased. Yet history would eventually reveal something Joseph could not see. The prison was not the end of his journey. It was another stage of preparation. In fact, some of the most important relationships and opportunities of his life would emerge from the very place that looked like complete defeat. But Joseph did not know that yet. From his perspective, another door had closed. Another season of uncertainty had begun. Another chapter filled with questions stretched before him. The dreamer who once imagined a remarkable future now sat in a place where hope would have been difficult to maintain. And as days turned into months and months stretched into years, a new challenge emerged, one perhaps even harder than loss itself. It was the challenge of being forgotten. Prison can take away freedom, but it can also take away something far more valuable, the belief that anyone remembers you. For Joseph, this became the defining challenge of the next season of his life. The shock of losing his position was painful, but the passing of time introduced a different kind of struggle. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. The routines rarely changed. The walls remained the same. The future seemed impossible to predict. Yet even in that environment, Joseph continued responding to adversity in a way that set him apart. Instead of surrendering to despair, he remained engaged with the people around him. He observed. He listened. He helped where he could. Once again, the qualities that had earned trust in Potiphar's household began to emerge. Prison did not change who Joseph was. It only changed where he was. Over time, responsibility found him again. Trust found him again. Opportunities to serve others found him again. It is one of the most remarkable patterns in his story. No matter how dramatically his circumstances changed, his character remained consistent. During this period, 2 officials connected to Pharaoh eventually entered the prison. Both were troubled by unusual dreams that left them searching for answers. Joseph listened carefully as they described what they had seen. Drawing upon the same gift that had shaped his own life years earlier, he offered interpretations of their dreams. The explanations were specific, memorable, and deeply meaningful to the men who heard them. Before they departed, Joseph made a simple request. He asked to be remembered. If an opportunity ever arose, perhaps someone could mention his situation to Pharaoh. Perhaps someone could help correct the injustice that had brought him there. It was a reasonable hope. After years of waiting, perhaps this was finally the turning point. Perhaps this was the moment when the door would open. Perhaps this was the beginning of his release. But the days continued. Then the months continued. Nothing happened. The opportunity Joseph had hoped for seemed to disappear. The official who had benefited from Joseph's help returned to his position and moved on with life. Joseph remained behind. Forgotten. Imagine how discouraging that must have felt. It is difficult enough to endure hardship. It is even harder to believe that a breakthrough is coming, only to watch it vanish. Yet this period of waiting reveals another profound truth. Some of life's most important developments occur when nothing appears to be happening at all. While Joseph sat in prison, events were quietly moving beyond his view. Conversations were unfolding. Circumstances were changing. A future opportunity was approaching that no human being could have arranged. The silence did not mean abandonment. The delay did not mean failure. The waiting itself was part of the process. Joseph could not see it, but the stage was being prepared for the most dramatic reversal of his life. And far beyond the prison walls, in the royal courts of Egypt, a problem was beginning to emerge that would soon capture Pharaoh's attention and create an opportunity that only one man could answer. Far beyond the prison walls, Pharaoh was facing a problem that none of his advisors could solve. The ruler of Egypt had experienced a series of troubling dreams so vivid and unsettling that they demanded an explanation. In the ancient world, dreams carried enormous significance, especially when they came to a king. Leaders believed that unusual dreams could contain warnings, guidance, or insight into future events. Pharaoh summoned wise men, officials, and interpreters from across his kingdom. Yet despite their knowledge and experience, no one could provide an answer that satisfied him. The uncertainty spread through the royal court. Egypt was the most powerful nation in the region, but even great empires could be shaken when their leaders faced questions that seemed impossible to answer. It was during this moment of confusion that a forgotten memory suddenly resurfaced. One of Pharaoh's officials remembered the young Hebrew he had encountered years earlier in prison. He remembered the accuracy of the dream interpretations. He remembered the confidence with which Joseph had explained events that later unfolded exactly as predicted. What had been forgotten for years became important in a single moment. Pharaoh immediately ordered that Joseph be brought before him. Imagine the scene. After years of confinement, Joseph was suddenly called into the presence of the most powerful ruler in the land. The distance between prison and palace was not measured in miles. It was measured in opportunity. Yet Joseph arrived knowing that this moment was bigger than personal advancement. Pharaoh described the dreams. They involved symbols that pointed toward Egypt's future, but their meaning remained hidden from everyone else. Joseph listened carefully. Then he provided an explanation unlike anything Pharaoh had heard from his advisors. The dreams, he explained, were not random. They were connected. They revealed that Egypt would experience 7 years of extraordinary abundance followed by 7 years of severe famine. The message was not merely a warning. It was an opportunity. If Egypt prepared during the years of plenty, the nation could survive the difficult years ahead. But if the warning was ignored, the consequences would affect countless lives. Joseph did more than interpret the dreams. He proposed a practical plan. Store grain during the abundant years. Build reserves. Organize resources. Prepare before the crisis arrives. It was a strategy that transformed uncertainty into action. Pharaoh immediately recognized the wisdom of both the interpretation and the plan. For years Joseph had waited for a door to open. For years he had endured setbacks that seemed meaningless. Yet in a single conversation, everything changed. The dreams that once isolated him from his brothers now placed him before a king. The gift that had seemed irrelevant inside a prison suddenly became essential to an empire. Looking back, the pattern becomes clear. Every stage of Joseph's journey had prepared him for this moment. The family conflicts, the years of service, the prison experience, the long waiting, all of it had shaped the leader standing before Pharaoh. And the ruler of Egypt was about to make a decision that would alter not only Joseph's future, but the future of entire nations. Pharaoh's decision was immediate and astonishing. Rather than simply thanking Joseph for his insight, he entrusted him with implementing the very plan he had proposed. In a single day, the man who had spent years forgotten in prison was elevated to one of the highest positions in Egypt. The transformation was extraordinary, but the real challenge was only beginning. Interpreting a dream required wisdom. Preparing an entire nation for a future crisis required leadership on a completely different scale. Joseph now carried responsibilities that stretched across the kingdom. During the 7 years of abundance, harvests exceeded expectations. Fields produced more grain than many people believed possible. Across Egypt, food flowed into storage facilities as Joseph organized one of the most ambitious preparation efforts in the ancient world. The task demanded careful planning, accurate record-keeping, and coordination across vast distances. Yet year after year, the system worked. While others celebrated the prosperity of the moment, Joseph remained focused on the future. He understood that abundance would not last forever. The warning contained within Pharaoh's dreams guided every decision he made. Then the years of abundance came to an end. Just as the dreams had predicted, difficult conditions began to spread across the region. Crops failed. Supplies became scarce. Families, communities, and entire nations faced growing uncertainty. The crisis extended far beyond Egypt's borders. Areas that depended upon seasonal harvests suddenly found themselves struggling to meet basic needs. Yet Egypt stood in a unique position. Because preparations had been made in advance, reserves were available when they were needed most. The grain gathered during the years of plenty became a lifeline during the years of shortage. People traveled from distant lands seeking assistance. Caravans crossed deserts. Travelers arrived from neighboring regions. Word spread that Egypt possessed resources while many other places faced increasing hardship. The significance of Joseph's leadership now became clear. His work was not merely protecting one nation. It was helping sustain countless lives across an entire region. The young dreamer who once struggled to understand the meaning of his own future had become a leader whose decisions affected people he would never meet. Looking back, every stage of his journey suddenly appeared connected. The administrative skills developed in Potiphar's household. The patience learned during years of waiting. The wisdom sharpened through adversity. None of those experiences had been wasted. Each one prepared him for responsibilities larger than he could have imagined. Yet despite all the success surrounding him, one chapter of Joseph's story remained unfinished. The years had passed. His position had changed. His influence had grown beyond anything he once thought possible. But the family he lost long ago still existed beyond Egypt's borders. The brothers he had not seen for years were living through the same regional crisis affecting everyone else. They had no idea who Joseph had become. They could not possibly imagine that the official overseeing Egypt's resources was the same young man whose dreams had once frustrated them. And as the famine continued to spread, events were quietly moving them toward a reunion that would reveal the deepest meaning behind everything Joseph had endured. As the famine continued, people from many regions journeyed to Egypt in search of food. Among them were Joseph's own brothers. Years had passed since he had last seen them. Time had changed many things. Joseph now stood as one of the most influential leaders in the world, while his brothers arrived as ordinary travelers seeking grain for their families. When they entered his presence, they did not recognize him. Why would they? The young man they once knew was gone. The boy from Canaan had become an Egyptian administrator dressed in the authority of Pharaoh's kingdom. Yet Joseph recognized them immediately. In that moment, memories from decades earlier must have rushed back into his mind. The family he had lost. The dreams that had confused everyone. The long road through hardship, disappointment, and waiting. Everything seemed to converge in a single encounter. Joseph faced a choice. He could focus on the pain of the past, or he could view the past through the lens of everything that had happened since. Over a series of meetings, Joseph tested his brother's character and observed how much they had changed. The men standing before him were no longer the same individuals he had known as a teenager. Time, responsibility, and life experience had shaped them as well. Eventually, the moment arrived when Joseph revealed his identity. The brothers were stunned. The powerful official who controlled access to food was the very brother they had not seen for years. Fear and uncertainty filled the room. They remembered the past. They understood the authority Joseph now possessed. They did not know what he would do. Yet Joseph's response revealed the deepest lesson of his entire story. Rather than dwelling on resentment, he chose reconciliation. Rather than allowing old wounds to determine the future, he focused on a larger perspective. He explained that although many events in his life had appeared tragic or meaningless at the time, they had ultimately contributed to something greater. The years of hardship had positioned him to preserve lives during a crisis affecting entire nations. The dreams of his youth had not been about personal status. They had been connected to a purpose far bigger than himself. Through Joseph's leadership, food reached people who desperately needed it. Through his planning, families survived difficult years. Through his willingness to see beyond immediate circumstances, relationships that seemed permanently broken found a path toward restoration. Looking back across his journey, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The pit was not the end. The foreign land was not the end. The false accusation was not the end. The prison was not the end. Every setback that appeared final became part of a larger story still unfolding. That is why Joseph's life continues to resonate thousands of years later. His story reminds us that purpose is often hidden within process, that growth frequently occurs during seasons of waiting, and that some of life's greatest opportunities emerge from circumstances we never would have chosen. The dreamer who once struggled to understand his future eventually discovered that every chapter, even the painful ones, had been preparing him for a role that would impact nations and change countless lives forever.